mentioned in the sermon that I might be bringing back these cutting room floor videos, just sharing with you some of the things that either I was thinking about or reading about in the week leading up to the sermon that just for whatever reason didn't make the cut. So here's another one. We're talking about 7 deadly sins, and last Sunday we looked at the sinful condition of slothfulness. Again, not just inactivity, but slothfulness really in love, right? Slothfulness in our love towards God, slothfulness in our love towards neighbor, friends and family, brothers and sisters in Christ. And if I had more time, I would have loved to have fleshed out in the sermon the connection that the ancient writers saw between oppressive sorrow, or what we might consider depression today, and that state of slothfulness. Right? If you think about it, if you've ever struggled with depression, you know that one of the difficult things to come by is probably motivation. Motivation to be at the responsibilities of life, motivation to be at investing in relationships, motivation to pursue the calling that God has for you, motivation maybe even just to get out of bed in the morning. And part of the reason for that is because that payoff or that payback of joy and happiness is not there, right? The joy and happiness that we might normally get from investing ourselves in things that we enjoy or relationships, for whatever reason, it's not there. And so motivation is tough to come by. And there's a ton that we could talk about for another time in relation to depression and how you fight through that motivation. But one caution with that, I think the ancient writers would say, be careful what you run to in those states of sorrow and depression. Sometimes we'll run after anything that will give a slight little dopamine fix, or anything that will make us feel something, feel alive. And the danger is that sometimes the stuff that we run to turns into this, feedback loop that winds up keeping us in this sorrowful state or keeping us lacking motivation. Like, for example, maybe we run, you grab your phone in times of depression and you just start scrolling through social media or the sports page or whatever, because you're just looking, I don't know for what, or maybe you're just looking to distract yourself from whatever thoughts are running rampant in your head in those times of depression and sorrow. Okay, but the problem is, actually, Nicholas Carr, he wrote a book called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain. And in it, he talks about what happens when we become kind of addicted to these things. He says, the more we take refuge in distraction, the more habituated we become to mere stimulation, and the more desensitized we become to delight. We lose our capacity to stop and ponder something deeply, to admire something beautiful for its own sake, to lose ourselves in the passion of a game, a story, or a person. And in other words, what he's saying is that the more we run to these things, the more desensitized we become to the things that might normally give us joy and happiness, right? And so you can see how this is like this negative feedback loop that we start spiraling down and we lose more and more motivation, right? So be cautious about that. And I think too, if the ancient writers were writing today, they might talk about the connection between anxiety and slothfulness. Anxiety being the major mental health epidemic of the day, and something that, if you think about it, would keep us from moving forward. Right? That's what anxiety does, right? You think about like a kid that's walking out on a high dive, about to jump into the water for a first time, maybe. And as he's walking out, he can sense the excitement and the thrill that's there, but he's also feeling this anxiety, which is always telling him, no, walk back. Don't take this risk, right? It would keep him from the adventure of it. And again, there's a whole ton of things that play into our anxiety, but I think one of them could be that in our hyper technology, whatever age, we have more and more control over aspects of life. So much so that we become lovers of control. So much so that when we think about a situation that might be slightly out of our control or slightly unpredictable, like we are not as adept to handle that as people in the past might be. And that creates an anxiety in us, and we hesitate to move forward. if that makes sense. So hold that thought for a second. We talked about two things to be cautious about in relation to slothfulness. But then there's one other tool that we didn't get to talk about on Sunday that I think is really valuable. It's a tool or a spiritual discipline that God's people have been taking advantage of literally from day one, and that is the gift of the Sabbath, which is also considered a spiritual discipline because when done rightly, it's something that you do week in and week out. And if you think about what the Sabbath always was and is, right, it's a day where first of all, it's a day that we are called to recognize as holy and set it apart, meaning we don't do the things that we do day 1 through 6, right? We set that seventh day apart as holy. And it's also a day for rest, right? But rest, ironically, you would say, well, how is rest an antidote to slothfulness? Well, biblically speaking, rest didn't necessarily mean inactivity either. It just meant stopping from the things that we work at days 1 through 6 so that we can receive from God whatever he would have to give to us, right? When you think about, when we go to work, we put our hands to the plow, we go to work, and then we take what is rightfully ours as a result of the work that we've put in, right? But when you rest from your labors, whatever you get or whatever you have that day is all gift, right? It's what God gives you of his grace. So throughout the Bible, Sabbath was a day to stop and to remember that God is the creator, right? That he is the one who has created this wonderful home for us to enjoy. He is the architect. He's the designer. He's also the sustainer of that world. In the book of Exodus, Sabbath is a day to stop and also remember the mighty acts of God's deliverance and his redemption, right? So for us on the back end of the New Testament, right, it's a day to stop and remember the resurrection of Christ from the dead and all that that means for us. Sabbath is a day to join with my brothers and sisters. It's another key point. It was never a day just to enjoy by ourselves and rest on our own, but it was a day to rest in community and where we declare to one another, the richness of who God is and what he's done, and we receive the gift of God's Spirit ministering to us through one another. Or one more thing, Sabbath, I think in the New Testament, there's some indication that Sabbath is also this day where we look forward to all that is yet to come, right? So it's a day to soak in the promises of God as well too. And I just highlight that because think about that. If you're struggling with motivation on Monday morning or any day of the week, just think about how the Sabbath can be a powerful antidote to that, right? Because Sabbath is this day where we are to stop and receive the goodness and the grace of God that's all around us. Sabbath is a day where we remember, okay, in those situations that seem out of our control or unpredictable, remember that God is the creator and the sustainer, and he is the one who is guiding all of life and creation towards that good appointed goal that he has for it. And so as I think about that, maybe I'm not quite as anxious about things that are outside of my control, right? Or as I go into Monday morning with this reservoir of grace come as a result of being in fellowship and communion with my brothers and sisters and being reminded through the word and through worship of all that God is, right? I've got this, well, let me quote from Eugene Peterson, I think who says it best. He says, when we work, we are most godlike, which means that it is also in our work that it's easiest to develop God pretensions. Unsabbathed, our work becomes the entire context in which we define our lives. We lose God consciousness, God awareness, sightings of resurrection. We lose the capacity to sing, "This is my Father's world," and instead end up chirping little self-centered ditties about what we are doing and feeling. In other words, what Eugene Peterson and writers through the ages have been saying is that, it's Sabbath that motivates us Monday morning to be at the wonderful, glorious calling that God has for us and to be at work in his creation, however he would lead us. And without that gift of Sabbath, our work can very easily just become all about us, and it can become tiresome and wearying and all that. So anyway, two things that I would have loved to explore more, two things that maybe you can explore on your own. Be cautious about the negative feedback loops that we get into in our depressive states. Be cautious about how anxiety might keep us in a state of slothfulness, and then consider the gift of the Sabbath and all that that could, or maybe the much more positive feedback loop of the Sabbath and all that that could be for us as we press into all that God calls us to. So anyway, there are some things to think about. Hope it's helpful.